Good day, everyone, and welcome to our how-to webinar on how we pulled together the Get Hired virtual conference in the last week of April. My name is Jen Davies, and I'm the Manager of Career Development Services in the Academic Advising and Career Center, and it's a real pleasure to be bringing two people to the forefront today who spent an awful lot of time in the background making the conference a success. Please welcome Florence Chan and Adrian Berg, both of my team. Let's say hi, folks.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
And I'm the planning coordinator.
And Adrian?
Hi, I'm Adrian Berg, and I'm Employment Engagement Coordinator at U of T Scarborough.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. So just so everybody knows, hopefully you noticed in our email of yesterday, we are role modeling today. So we're trying to show you exactly what students experienced as part of the conference. So we were sure to provide PowerPoints in advance for those who had a preference or need to be able to review those in advance. We will also be showing you some of the documents that we use to help students get ready to participate fully in the event as well. And just so you know, we have multiple computers going. So if you can see the list of participants, which I think you can, you'll see that I actually have two computers going on. One so that I can see what you're seeing, and also because we have a back channel happening, so that if we need to send a message, and it's very important that we don't accidentally send it to you, we can send it through a different mechanism. And Florence has two computers going as well. She's our chief technical person, and she is making extra sure that everything that you're seeing looks appropriately. So there's just a couple of quick behind the scenes things right up front that we were engaged in, and we'll get into some more depth on those in a couple of minutes. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what is the Get Hired conference. We're going to talk about how we transition the conference from an in-person, well-established conference. Get Hired has happened every year since I've worked at the AENCC, so since 2014. How we moved it online. We're going to talk about more about technology, what you need to make it successful. We're going to talk about some of the communication, extra communication, over communication that maybe sometimes we felt like we were doing, but was actually very much appreciated by our participants. And we're going to talk about people power. It sounds, it seems like on the surface maybe that running an online conference would require fewer people and less people power. Our experience was, you still need every hand that you would have needed to make the online conference a success. And then we'll share some of the lessons that we learned. Hopefully that's what everyone was here for today, so that's what we're going to get into. So what was the plan? Well, we have run Get Hired, as I said, since 2014, and it's a 3-day plan of scaffolded themes. People from education will appreciate that. Scaffolded themes and learning goals, which really help us to focus the conference content in a really structured way. So what we have are 3 daily themes. The first day, the importance of getting to know yourself. Those of you who work in career development know that it's important to know what you're offering the labor market to be able to find a good fit for yourself, right? To find satisfying work. And then day 2 is focused on the tools that you need. So that's more about the self-expression. Like here's what I have now. How do I put it out there? How do I market myself? And then throughout the 3 days, we're talking about networking. But on the 3rd day, we really try to drive it home by bringing employers in. This year it was as a panel. Last year we ran a little mini job fair when we were still doing the conference in person, which was very popular. So that's sort of how the conference rolls. And I mention it because the learning goals for the conference really help us to drive the individual activities that we tried to do. And as we're going to talk about, technology influences the activities that you can offer. So in the end, the learning goals actually drive all the way back down and tie into the technology that we were using, and really helped us again to make decisions at a very granular level as part of the conference. So as an example, and again, you have a link in your PowerPoint. I also have it here, and I'll flip over to it in a second. But we had an overall learning outcomes questionnaire for the conference. And so one of the questions that we were asking, for example, was how well can you express the knowledge and skills that you've gained through your education as they apply to the world of work? And we asked this question actually as students were registering for the conference as part of a pre and post survey. Getting my post data is always a lot harder, but I can require the pre data, which increases my chances of being able to get post data later. But I can just very quickly flip over and show you what the overall learning conference survey looks like. We offer prizes, of course. Everyone loves a Tim Hortons gift card, so we do a prize draw at the end of the survey period. the post survey. This is for the post survey. There's no prize necessarily for completing your registration, but this is the post survey. Another example of the kinds of questions that we ask around goal setting. Can you articulate goal setting? Because that's one of the topics that we cover in the conference, okay? And I'm happy to talk nerdy about data analysis anytime anyone wants, but I don't want to spend too much more time on that, but you have the entire survey if you'd like to see it. And so these learning outcomes drive the whole conference. And then at the end of each day of programming, we're actually asking students to do what's called a pre-post, because we ask them to measure it at the same time. We do a pre-post daily survey. And again, here's an example of the kind of survey that we do. Rate your level of knowledge or understanding before, and then on the same survey, we ask them, and after, what do you think? And most years, the greatest learning is on, I'm curious if people can throw in the chat, what general job search topic or topic that I've already told you as part of Get Hired gets the greatest learning? Just throw some ideas in the chat. What do you think students learn the most? Networking, get to know yourself, self-knowledge. Can I have one more? Oh, someone may have popped something in the Q&A. Goal setting, thank you. And then confidence and social skills, interviewing, thank you so much. So one of the skills that you're gonna have to learn if you're gonna facilitate an online conference is patience and comfort with silence. Because it takes people time, like, oh, you want me to do something, right? And then they have to get to their keyboard, and so it takes an extra couple of seconds really for things to tick over in a way that doesn't happen in person. And there's no body language to read, right? I can't see you. So, oh, and cats also get involved in conferences when they're online. So most years, the greatest learning was actually on, let me make sure that I can get there. It was actually on Get to Know Yourself. Very good. Who was that? Cherry? Very good, Cherry. So it was actually on the Get to Know Yourself. And so that's a very important factor that we've been using as part of planning for costs, because good assessment tools sometimes have a cost attached, and have really helped us prioritize that day one, that really getting to know yourself piece is actually really, really important. Talking about inclusion, I catch back up with my slides. So again, we shared two documents that you have in the PowerPoint that we sent out yesterday. Great document, considerations on how to run a conference from the AODA office at U of T, and Florence's What to Expect document. She's going to talk a little bit more about that later, so I'm not going to get into it right now. But just to highlight, it's really, really important that right up front in your conference registration that you are asking for the accommodation needs of your participants. There are budget implications for good accommodation as well. So for example, closed captioning. True story, we had some money in the budget. I had sort of earmarked it for something else, but then we did have a request for closed captioning, and so thankfully we still had that budgetary space to be able to do it. So really best practices is plan ahead for that cost. It's also important that you tell participants what to expect, because sometimes it's not only physical needs like hardness of hearing, for example, but someone may have additional technological needs that they need to be ready to work on to be able to participate fully in your event. Someone may have physical needs that they may need to be able to, again, plan to accommodate. And if they know it's coming, then they can put those things in place for themselves, or you help put them in place, right? Depends, you have to talk to them. And sometimes it's psychological needs. I'm extroverted, so, you know, for me, the more people in my day, the better. But for example, someone who is just very introverted, not even, you know, dealing with anything that's diagnosable, just someone who's really introverted, needs to plan ahead, like, okay, so I'm gonna have to talk with, there's going to be breakout rooms and I'm going to have to talk to people, right? They just want to get themselves ready for it. And so it's very important to be able to communicate what people can plan to expect. And this is true for both in-person and online conferences. This is actually not unique for something being online. It's true for any kind of environment. So how does technology impact your learning activities? I kind of hinted at it earlier. I just realized my Q&A box went away. So just in case we need something, I'm going to pull that up. as we mentioned before, your technology actually does impact and interact with the decisions that you make around your learning activities. For example, we had intended to use Zoom's breakout feature. You may have seen Zoom's breakout feature. You may have experienced it before. It's fabulous. And we had intended to use it for some small group activities. Now, just so you know, enrollment for Get Hired is usually around 175, so 175 students. So when enrollment hit 250, it was more than we had expected. And we were starting to have to make some decisions. So breakout rooms, there are only about 20 breakout rooms allowed in a Zoom meeting. So we realized that already we were dealing with groups that were not going to be small. These breakout room groups were actually going to be a lot bigger than we were kind of hoping for. It's a nice problem to have, but you know, okay. So the experience in the breakout rooms wasn't already going to be what we wanted it to be. And so when enrollment reached 400 from our usual 175, when enrollment reached 400, we realized that we were not going to be able to use Zoom meetings anymore. We were going to have to use Zoom webinars. They have slightly different functionality. Zoom meetings only accommodates 300. Zoom webinars will accommodate up to 500. And Zoom webinar does, which is what we're in right now, Zoom webinar does not have breakout rooms. On the other hand, we were kind of not devastated because the breakout rooms were already a lot larger than we really had wanted them to be. So it was fine. So what we did is we adjusted the learning activities to suit the new technological environment that we were going to have to work in. Now, thankfully, we had 4 days to get ready for that, but it certainly meant some quick adjustments on the part of the facilitators and our technical people. Florence had to learn a few new tricks, and so did Adrian, on exactly how everything was going to go. So at this point, I'd actually like to turn the conversation over to Florence to talk about how some of this actually worked on the back end.
Sure. So when the Jen, can I? Yeah, okay. So when the decision was first made that Get Hired will now be taking place online with 6 weeks of lead up time to the conference day, one of the very first questions that came up was, what technology do we use? What platform do we use? And I very quickly learned that there are many different video conferencing platforms available out there as an option. So here's just a snapshot of them. On the left-hand side here of all the different video technology platforms available. And I also learned that in addition to these, there are also companies that provide virtual event platforms, which offers additional features and functions over and above just the video technology. So these companies, again, a snapshot of them are listed on the right-hand side here. So these are really companies that provide services in addition to technology and really making them more of a one-stop shop for the events and taking care of things like event landing page, taking care of registration, and again, a lot more different features. So I think for us, ultimately, the decision on what platform and which approach to take really depended on the specific needs on the programming, like Jen said, and what kind of interactions we want, existing infrastructures that were already in place, and for us to, again, with the tight timeline, what is most of our team already using and already familiar with. I think those were important considerations in actually selecting the platform. Can we go to the next slide, please? And here is just a simple kind of matrix outlining different low bandwidth alternatives that are available out there, ranging from high bandwidth to low bandwidth, high immediacy to low immediacy. And for us, again, just thinking about what low bandwidth alternatives can we use to really complement the live programming that was taking place of the conference. So as an example, we use email a lot to be sending out both reminders, follow-ups, information to students who registered before, during, and after the conference, providing readings that and kind of homework students can be doing. For example, the career interest assessment they can do on their own time, again, ahead of the conference. And these are activities that can take place well ahead and in the student's own time. And then for the next slide, we're going to be spending a bit of time just, again, walking through what the process was like for our team in those 6 weeks when we really transitioned Get Hired from in-person to an online delivery, and how we did that kind of step by step. So starting off with researching, best practices on virtual events, on virtual conferences, really talking to colleagues at U of T on, their tips and what they've learned from online programming they've done so far. Some kind of key questions came up from that research. So first, one of them being, do we take that do-it-yourself approach, really, setting up everything ourselves, doing registration ourselves, and really kind of owning all of those components for the entire event? Or do we approach a vendor? So again, approaching and hiring one of those companies listed a couple of slides back who do offer those, bigger platforms that have many more kind of like bells and whistles that we could use. Are we thinking of doing single sessions, kind of one after another throughout the day? Or do we want to host concurrent sessions so students can have multiple options to choose which one to attend? And then for that approach, if we're doing, parallel tracks with concurrent sessions, an important consideration is typically with a lot of the paid, video conferencing platforms only allows users to run one session at a time, meaning that if you do want to host multiple sessions, you really do need to buy additional licenses in order to do that. Do we want to host all the sessions live? So they're all just streaming live in real time. Do we want to have pre-recorded videos or a hybrid of those two delivery models? And then again, what platform to use and what capacity we're expecting and what capacity the platform needs to handle. So going back to what Jen said, going from the original 175 from in real life to over 400 really changed things for us in terms of taking into those considerations into account. So once we had really those kind of questions answered and some decisions made, we really spent quite a lot of time in our weekly team meetings really going through the planning phase. And I think, Jen, maybe you can probably elaborate more on what we did in terms of changing up the agenda and revising it to make it more appropriate for the online delivery. I'm just going to unmute Jen.
Sorry,
Jen?
I was still muted. It wouldn't let you unmute me. Sorry, I was being distracted by a question in the chat box because I was watching the chat box. What was I supposed to talk about?
If you want to just elaborate on how we revised the agenda in terms of kind of like delaying the start and end times and.
Oh, absolutely, yes. So in terms of how we decided to adjust the day, we sort of reflected on people in our lives and sort of what we were experiencing as well. So ordinarily with Get Hired, the day starts around 9 a.m. and wraps up with 5. The idea being that we're simulating a workday, right? The so-called 9-to-5 job. So that students get that experience. I don't know what your first job was like, or if you can remember your first 9-to-5 job. I just remember being bone tired by the end of my first Friday and my first full-time 9-to-5 job. So we wanted students to kind of experience that, to get ready for it so they can plan for it. But of course, in our online environment, the chances are that students are going to be working remotely, which means their next job may not be 9-to-5. And in addition, folks had begun to be programmed, I think, to sleep in a little later and stay up a little later. I think the night owl in a lot of us was starting to come out because we didn't have to be anywhere at 8 or 9 in the morning. So we shifted the whole day to start around 10:30 in the morning, both to boost our attendance and just to acknowledge the reality that a lot of us were actually now, on a slightly different sleep schedule, especially young people, right? Young people tend to night owl status anyway. So thankfully, our speakers were very understanding and agreed to adjust the timing of the keynotes, agreed to adjust the timing of their sessions. And in the end, I think everybody was really happy with the attendance that we got. I can't remember if we're going to talk about attendance, but I can certainly share that later on. It was very good.
Thanks, Jen. And then Adrian, you can probably speak more to the planning we did in terms of sourcing, speakers and guests to join us.
Yeah, so we had the conference included not only our workshops, but we also had our keynotes. We had an employer recruiter panel. We had a demo interview, and we had external guest speakers too. So all of that was ongoing as we were planning the conference. And I was doing most of that coordination and communication with the external guest. And there's more to come later on in the presentation, kind of about what we did with them and how we communicated with them to make sure everything ran smoothly.
Thanks, Adrian. So moving on to more of the preparation stage. So really thinking through what do we need to produce ahead of time so that students already have those items on hand and available before the conference starts. So what information needs to be published online, on the conference website and on the registration page. Creating transition slides that we can be putting up with some key information both at the start, in the middle, at the end, and at the end of the days. Coordinating with all our speakers and facilitators regarding timing, the format that will be taking place. For example, a keynote speaker is a different format than a recruiter panel. And then, for example, getting permissions from our speakers in terms of, a media release form so that we can upload our video recordings, for students to see at a later time. Testing, more testing. I think looking back now, I feel like I really underestimated how much time would really be involved with the testing, not only just for myself, just opening up Zoom in a practice session, looking through all the controls, but also with colleagues and teammates, making sure they're comfortable and familiar with the environment. And then again, along with Adrian, with our external speakers and keynotes and panelists to do those run-throughs so that they're also comfortable with the platform ahead of time. And I think that piece alone was quite time consuming, I would say. And then as part of the testing, watching some of those video recordings that you would have from those practice sessions to make sure, the video recordings are looking what you would want to see afterwards. Then in terms of the actual delivery, like mentioned before, updating the conference website and registration, delivering the detailed agenda to registrants ahead of time, along with the what to expect document, having all the PowerPoints and handouts already collected and uploaded into a Google Share Drive for the students to see and download before the conference. And then from the back end of things, really going into Zoom and adjusting all those settings both on the account level and then when you're actually in the webinar, adjusting the controls there as well. And then of course, pulling all those reports that we need from the Zoom accounts afterwards. Next slide, please. And then just to elaborate, I think some more on the key considerations that we've already talked about, but in terms of logistics and scheduling, I think one of the most important parts is assigning roles and specific tasks to staff who will be on, part of the conference. And then making sure, for example, there are enough breaks, and then deciding when will there be breaks, how long will they be, making sure there's a flow to the day so that we can transition smoothly from one session to the next, even with breaks in between. And then when we do have those concurrent sessions at the end of the day, making sure that students know kind of where they're going after the break, if they are leaving kind of the room to a separate one for those concurrent sessions. I think, for example, a lot of the questions that I posed to the team, again, during one of those weekly team meetings would be things like, who will introduce the speakers, who will introduce the panelists, who will be monitoring the chat box and the Q&A. If someone accidentally unmutes himself, who will make sure they know that and, click the mute button right away. Will there be tech support? who will help a student out if they have trouble logging into the system? What if a guest is late, and they can't log in? So I think these were a lot of very detailed level questions that we need to kind of figure out when we do have those team meetings to make sure everything runs smoothly. Jen, do you want to just open up the rundown document really quick? So when we did have those kind of roles identified and we know, who's doing what when, I then kind of very similar to how I would usually create, an event itinerary, I created a detailed daily rundown for our team that we can refer to during events day. And so we know, for example, let's say if a speaker is scheduled, at 10:30, we know when they need to be on standby and kind of like ready to go on the back end, so that event staff can know to also to look out for them. So I think in an online environment, it's pretty necessary to really document who's doing what, even if it might be obvious or even if it might be common sense. But it's easy to miss those little things like click start record, end record. So little things like that, I find it helpful just for myself to have that written down so everyone knows, that those things won't be missed. Okay, and back to the slide. And then again, just to touch on accessibility, I think just our colleagues at the Accessibility Office and the AODEA Office are really experts at this area, and they're really, amazing resources to have in terms of getting their input and suggestions on what we can do to best accommodate. So some of those things include outlining expectations, providing closed captioning, and also transcripts for the recording afterwards. Next slide.
Before we go on, Florence, I think this question is appropriate right here. Arjun is wondering, if you use webinars instead of breakout rooms, did all your guest speakers enter and then just wait in the main room before they presented? How did you engage participants without breakout rooms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So because we had many different sessions a day, for speakers who are, for example, joining us in the middle of the day, we would have to coordinate with them beforehand to give them a specific time they'll be joining us, and then also instructions on, okay, here's what you'll see on the screen at that time when you join in, so they're not confused. And then let them know again, for example, okay, when you join, Adrian will promote you to, let's say, a panelist, and then when Jen introduces you, that's when you'll start your camera and go on screen. So really telling them all those instructions beforehand so they know. And then in terms of the interaction piece, when there isn't, for example, the breakout room feature and there is a larger group, then we're really relying on more of the other tools, for example, the chat. So having the co-facilitators really engaging the audience through the chat, asking questions, getting their feedback. There's a poll feature, so we often have poll questions set up ahead of time that you can kind of make live, just to kind of survey the audience and again get their interaction that way. And then we also use the raise hand feature. So we will take volunteers from the audience, for example, when they're doing a group activity, taking, let's say, 3 volunteers, click the raise hand button, and they'll be allowed to speak and kind of give their responses to the activity. Okay. Can we get to the next slide, please? All right. So I won't go into too much detail in terms of the actual setup of Zoom, as this is very platform specific. But I think the key takeaway for me and what I learned is, one, double check all the settings, both on the account level, because there's many things you can turn on and off for features you want enabled. So doing that, again, ahead of time. And then 2, just being mindful of what you want the audience to see on the screen. So just as an example, having one keynote speaker where the audience will just see the keynote speaker on the screen is very different from, let's say, a recruiter panel of 6 recruiters, and you might want students to see all the recruiters on the screen at the same time. So just noting down, what view you want students to see ahead of time, so you can make those adjustments in real time. Next slide. I think just one Backend. And then again, here is just another example of all the different controls on the back end as a host that you can turn on and off, and just going through them carefully at the beginning of the sessions. The next slide here is a picture of my actual setup on my dining room table with my two computers here on the right-hand side. We have the Zoom webinar window, the chat, and then the attendee list just kind of all open, so I can see them all at a glance. And then on the left-hand side, I have my other laptop logged in as a student, so I can monitor what the students are seeing all the time. And then I have my handy-dandy detailed rundown open there, so I know I'm following along my own schedule.
Okay, I'm going to take over for the next little bit here and talk about communication. And like in most things, communication is key. And we ask ourselves a lot of questions early on in the planning. Florence actually pulled together this really long list of questions, which we went through over a series of meetings and spent weeks working on. Questions included things like, how are we going to communicate with students? What are we going to put on the website? What are we going to send by email? When are we going to do it? How are we going to handle registration? Which we ended up doing via our own platform, CLNX, which is what we use for all of our other student events. How are we going to have Zoom links send out to our students? Of course, we've all heard about Zoom bombing and that kind of thing on the news. And when we were planning the conference, of course, we only had 6 weeks. We were all thrown into working from home. We have cats walking around, some people have kids walking around. And so we wanted to make sure that we didn't have problems with that. So we decided, some of the answers for these questions were, we decided about 2 weeks before the conference, we would send out an email to everybody who had registered to that point, keep the momentum going. Because some people have registered for our conference even before we decided to turn it virtual. We sent out one big email 2 weeks before the conference, letting people know, we're glad that you're there. Here's a rough agenda of what we're working on. It's gone virtual. We also sent out a teaser about our keynote speaker and made sure people got excited about the conference and kept excited. We also let them know that we were going to communicate with them again 1 week before the conference, so the Tuesday prior, with all the other information that they needed. And then 1 week before the conference, we sent them the agenda, we sent them some instructions. We also told them 1 week before that we would send them the Zoom links 24 hours prior to the conference by email, so to check their email and contact us if they didn't get it. That way, we weren't putting the Zoom links out on social media, for example, and we were controlling and minimizing our risk for that. We also needed to decide, as Florence mentioned earlier, what platform we were going to use to share the documents. You might have caught, Florence was mentioning, there was a self-assessment that students exercised they were going to work on before one of the workshops on day one, if possible. So we wanted to make sure they got that in advance. We had PowerPoints. We sent them all the documents, all the PowerPoints, all the handouts, all the sample job postings. Everything was sent out before the conference. So we ended up hosting that via Google Drive. We sent them those links, and it was an ongoing process to update our detailed agenda, a little bit different than an agenda for an in-person conference, because we wanted to make it really easy for them. And Jen, if you could open up the detailed agenda, just page 1 for the moment on there, that'd be great. And this is included, I think, in what we're emailed out to you too. So the detailed agenda, as you'll notice on there, at the top, we included embedded links for all of the handouts. So if they wanted to go and get all the handouts for day 1, they're all in one place, easy to access. The Zoom link and the Zoom password, we had one link for each day rather than having a whole bunch of different sessions. We're trying to make it feel like a full real conference where you go in, you spend the day there. So we had one link and password for each day, and it's embedded right on the agenda. And then we did have to have separate links with Zoom for concurrent sessions, because we couldn't do two at the same place. And every day had a new link. So all the information was put in there, so it was really one quick click. We did have a what to expect document also, which elaborated on some of the more Q&A of what students might want, thank you, Jen, what students might want to expect about how's it going to work, and are there breaks, and that kind of stuff. So there's a what to expect document, which we also sent out to students in advance. So if you need to, they're really helpful. If you want to take a look through these documents, if you're planning your own event, please feel free to do so. We spent a lot of time on those ones, and I think it paid off a lot. Other questions which we asked for communication are things like walkthroughs and practice runs, which Florence mentioned. Were we going to do them not only with our own presenters, which we did many of them, in order to work through all the little things that came up along the way, but also with external speakers. So, for example, we had a demo interview with one of our HR partners in a company, and also with a volunteer student. So we went through how that's going to work. If they wanted to forward us their PowerPoint and have us go through it and click through, like Jen's doing for me now, or if they were going to do it themselves. If they wanted to put up polls, if they had to monitor the Q&A box or chat box, we let them know they didn't have to. So we did all that through run-throughs. So Florence and I did, I don't remember, maybe 10 or 12 different run-throughs the week before the conference. Took a lot of time, but they were really valuable to make sure that we're all on the same page. And so I would highly recommend those. That was a great learning from there. Some of them were really quick. Some only took 5 minutes. Some of them took 15, 20 minutes, really depending on the level of comfort they had with the technology and what we were going to do with them. So we did the run-throughs. We also had to talk about, for communication, how students can ask questions. So depending if you're using webinar or Zoom meetings or another platform, do we want them to type them in the chat box? Do we want them to use the Q&A box? So we talked about that internally quite a bit too. One other thing that we did is if students or external speakers had trouble logging in. So on event day, I'm going to go through who did what in just a minute, but on event day, one of the things I was responsible for is also monitoring our email, so that if students tried to log into Zoom for the conference, but they couldn't, then who do they contact? So while Florence was doing certain things and Jen was doing certain things and other people were doing other things, how are we going to handle all of that? And same thing for our external guest. If you're waiting for a keynote and they can't log in, you want to make sure they can quickly contact you. So they had an easy way to contact me via my cell phone. Next slide, Jen. Another decision that we made early on is to use a Backchannel. And throughout even today's webinar, the three of us have been using a Backchannel. So we've been using that both before the conference and when we were getting started, but also I've been using it throughout the conference. So if my video's on, you see me kind of looking down when I'm not talking in a corner of the screen, I might be talking to somebody in the Backchannel. And that was a great thing to use. It avoided the risk of anybody who's watching the webinar or the conference typing the wrong thing in the wrong box. And it was really useful for coordinating all the things about when we're going to turn off the music, when are we going to start a new session, is there a problem with anything else happening? So that's really valuable. We use Microsoft Teams for the Backchannel while we're using Zoom for the presentation. Next slide. I won't go through this one in any great detail. There's a lot of text on here, but it's kind of reiterating what was mentioned earlier to make sure that on your team for your event that there are people who not only understand the content of what you're presenting, and also people who understand the technology. Florence spent many hours digging through everything and trying to troubleshoot, trying to make it happen what we wanted to do. And ideally, you have some people who are familiar with both, because the technology really influenced the learning activities, and the learning activities influence the technology. So we had one presenter who was trying to use annotations real time to enter information onto a slide. We already talked about breakout rooms or not, or if we wanted a quick answer to a question like Jen asked earlier about what was most valuable for students, you want to do a poll, enter it in the chat box. You want to use an external tool like Mentimeter, which one of our panelists did. So there's a lot of different ways to go through that to make sure that everything looks seamless, but everything impacts everything else. And so we had to pivot and change technology or change our content and how we were going to do smaller group exercises on a regular basis throughout. So make sure everything is clearly outlined, because when you're actually presenting like I am right now, you don't have the time to go as a presenter and check the chat box and why is the poll not working. So really have that all laid out ahead of time. And I think the next slide will get into that in a bit more detail. So one of the key things that we really worked on is who does what. And you saw already Florence put up the kind of daily rundown schedule. So we used Zoom for our conference, and technically there's a host who has a lot of power to run and start everything. We always assigned an alternative host. You never know, people's internet does go down, and hopefully mine will stay up for the next 2 minutes while I finish talking. But this morning when we're having our team meeting, it went down for a minute. So always have an alternative host. One of the things that we did right away when our team came in, we assigned all of our internal team to be co-host. So as soon as we saw our colleague Derek or Wendy or anybody come in, we immediately made them a co-host. Because as I said, speakers really focused on your content. So the co-host were the eyes and the ears of everything. They're watching the chat box. They're reminding people to, if you want to put something in chat for all attendees, make sure it's not just going to the panelist. Put your question in the Q&A. Watch out for any Zoom bombers or anything inappropriate. So the co-hosts were really, really important. And we always had one co-host who was dedicated to be a real co-host, who would be kind of the person who would then do the Q&A with our presenter. So when it came time for Q&A, we would have somebody saying, okay, Jamel, there's some questions in the box for you, and do that kind of aspect of things. That was all predetermined ahead of time. There's also a category for panelists, which you can assign before you start in your settings, and the panelists then have extra abilities to share screens. Of course, somebody has to give them that ability. So those are some of the technical roles other than attendees, but we also had an MC, that was Jen. Because we wanted the conference to feel like a regular full-day conference and flow from one to the other, Jen was responsible for making sure there was introductions. She was putting up transition slides in between one session and another, saying what's happening next, like we did at the beginning of this, saying starting at 12 o'clock. She would turn it on, off the music, basically keep the flow of the conference running. Another thing that it's good to have an MC, somebody like that available for, is what happens if one of your speakers all of a sudden loses their power or loses their internet connection, which actually happened. On day 2 in the afternoon, one of our speakers was maybe a third of the way or halfway through the presentation, and all of a sudden we lost them. And so Jen, as MC, jumped in and started and took over and started filling the gap, while in the background, Florence and I were in the background trying to contact our speaker and find out what happened, did you lose internet, we're waiting for you, and kind of do that back chat. So we ended up getting him back, but in the meantime, the MC could kind of fill that void. So you need that behind the scenes technical team too. That's really important to make sure, as Florence mentioned, make sure all the settings are set up the way you wanted them before every session, allowing speakers to share their screens. There's a lot of different sessions or settings, depending on what it is you're trying to do. We were also, kind of to answer a question that somebody had earlier, we were also watching for our external guests to come in. So when our keynotes or our demo interviewer, anybody came in, we were keeping an eye out for them so we could promote them to panelist or co-host right away. So many things different going on at the same time. So really for a one-off session, you may not need as many people, but if you're trying to do a conference with external guests and you're using a technology like Zoom Webinar, I'd recommend that you have at least 2 people doing these various things. And like I mentioned, we also had somebody, it was me doing student support in the background. So when students couldn't get in, there was a way for them to contact us during the session to get in and have that responsiveness. So we had a number of people who had trouble, various different issues, but they all got resolved within a couple of minutes and got in. And even today, during our how-to webinar, I, on the back channel, got a message from our front desk of somebody trying to get in here who couldn't get in. So when Florence was busy presenting, I was busy on the back channel trying to troubleshoot so we could get somebody else into our webinar. So that's, again, another important point. And I think I'm going to hand it back to you now, Jen.
If I could just ask, I just put a question in the chat box. I think looking at the participants list, I think there were a couple of people who observed Get Hired, and I'm just curious if you don't mind throwing in the chat box. Did it look seamless to you? I'm just curious. That was the goal. All right, maybe they'll get back to me later. I'm looking for a pat on the back here, but I thought we looked super seamless.
The long story short is that we needed more people than you might have thought you needed to do an online conference in order to, we thought it looked seamless, in order to have the presenter do their thing, watch the co-host, make sure everybody's questions are answered quickly, make sure any problems behind the scenes are ironed out quickly and effectively. So it was a full team event for the 3 days.
Thank you. And thank you. I got some warm fuzzies that I was looking for. So someone said, I never would have thought that many people were behind the scenes, but there were. That's what it takes to make it look seamless. And if anyone wants the link to the music, Florence found that on YouTube and it's lovely, and we can include that as well in our video after the session if you would like. So what were some of our wins at the NCC? We often like to talk about what were the wins. Well, there were some very significant ones. So first of all, I mean, planning for Get Hired every year starts in November, but there were some very significant changes that we had to make to the flow, and even at the nitty-gritty level down to some of the learning activities in only 6 weeks. So that was pretty significant. Another win for us, unintentional. Get Hired conference is always open to students from all 3 campuses, but of course Scarborough is a fair distance to travel if you live downtown or in Mississauga. And we had strong representation from St. George and even from UTM in terms of enrollment, where students are enrolled. But what's really interesting is in the background, Zoom reports tell you where people logged in from based on their IP addresses. And we had students from truly all over the world. It was pretty interesting. So I know they were staying up very late at night or getting up very early in the morning to join us, which was fabulous. In the end, we had 412 unique users. Honestly, among those were probably 35 or 40 U of T staff who were running things in the background or who dropped in because they wanted to see a keynote and so on, but that's still quite a significant number of students. Let's say maybe 375, whereas I usually only have 175. So it was huge reach, and we were really pleased about that. And we were really pleased with the variety of kinds of sessions that we offered. We had workshops. We had a concurrent offering at the end of the day, which was an interesting communication challenge, but it worked. We had guest speakers from industry and a panel at the end of the day. And students got really solid job hunting tips and strategies from us, from our guests, and from a wide variety of people. Now, someone was asking us, and I think this fits with sort of like kinds of sessions, someone's asking, did we rely solely on the chat box for responses or interaction, or did we also unmute and turn on video? Yes, we did, actually. Students could raise a hand. So you should all be able to see, I'm pretty sure, a raise the hand button. So students could raise their hand at times where we were asking for something. So for example, in our workshop on interviewing skills, we had prizes, but we never had to offer them, which was really funny. We had prizes ready to sort of dangle as carrots, but we never actually needed to use it. For example, took brave people who might be willing to share a STAR story, because we taught the STAR method for answering behavioral questions. Was anyone willing? We gave them 10 minutes, so they had 10 minutes of quiet. Well, it wasn't quiet, we played music, but students had 10 minutes to, after we taught it, they had 10 minutes to prepare their a draft of a STAR story. And then when we came back, we said, okay, is anyone brave enough to share it? So a student could put up their hand to volunteer, and then we unmuted them. So Florence could absolutely unmute someone. How did we do the music? I can send a how-to tutorial on how to do the music. It's an interesting thing that we figured out. And how did you do concurrent sessions with the webinar? Yeah, so we had links to different Zoom meetings. So I'm going to go back over to Adrian's detailed agenda. And I actually conveniently left it on the concurrent session. So we had, if you were interested in option 1, we were very clear in our transition slide. Our transition slide said, I think it was caps, underlined, bolded, everything. Stay here. Don't go anywhere if you were interested in this one. And then if you were interested in this one, we had it very clear on the transition slides. You can see it at the bottom of your screen. If you're interested in this workshop, go here. And Adrian, how long before this session started did you go open up the new room? Because it's basically a room.
Yeah, probably about maybe 15, 20 minutes before the previous session ended, I opened up the other room. And of course, that brings into that you need more staff then. Because if you're running 2 different sessions at the same time, you need technical people on the background, you need people watching the chat box, you need people watching the Q&A, all of those things for both sessions at the same time. So we spread ourselves a little bit thinner and everybody kept busy. But if you do concurrent, that's another thing just to keep in mind.
And I will say the back channel was particularly useful while the concurrent sessions were getting, we were getting ready for that break. We were getting ready for that switch. There were some mad typing. Is your room ready? Is the presenter set up? Is everything ready to go? Because remember, I'm the MC, right? So I'm just quietly, can I now send people that way? Which was a really, really, I would say that was an unintended use of the back channel that we didn't plan ahead that we would need that much communication when we split ourselves in half, but we really did. All right, is this me? Yes, it is. So on the value of learning goals, I would like to highly encourage everyone, whether you're offering a webinar, whether you're offering an online conference, to establish some really clear learning goals. And before I go on to that, though, there was a question about Teams as a back channel, so I might as well answer that while we're still talking about back channel. So when using Teams as a back channel, was there a risk of the notification sound and bubble jumping up on the share screen of the presenter? Yes. And that's why it's on my other computer over here. I actually separated it. Now, Adrian, I don't know how you're handling it, but I actually chose to run the back channel even on a separate computer, so there was no chance that that would happen. Do you want to share how you handled it, Adrian? Because I think you did it on one machine.
Yeah, I mean, during Get Hired, the conference, I wasn't presenting for the most part. I was behind the scenes, but I have my Teams notifications muted so that you don't hear any sound during the session. And for today, Jen is sharing the PowerPoint presentation and documents, not me. So I'm not sharing my screen at all. So you won't hear my beeps and you won't see any notifications come up.
There's no risk that you're going, that's why I'm doing the slides. There's no risk that you're going to have pop-ups popping up on your screen. Yeah. So it's all about thinking that stuff through. And that's where testing for us was really, really valuable. And, oh, wait, I'm sharing slides, but now this thing is jumping. Okay, so I have to make sure I shut that down and find another way.
I can jump into a comment on I saw in the chat box, and everyone doesn't have to have 2 computers going. As long as you have somebody on your team. It was Florence during our conference who had 2 computers going. So you're probably your technical person will want to have the 2 computers going to monitor everything, but the rest of the people just had 1 computer going.
Thank you. And Florence, I don't know, there was a quick question about attendance. What was our best day, our biggest day for logins? Someone's asking.
Yeah, I would say the biggest day was definitely day 1. Day 1 had the most people. I'm just kind of looking at my numbers here. I don't recall specifically, but I would say kind of the max kind of users logging in at the same time was somewhere like 220, I want to say, or 230. But I'll have to double check.
I thought it was 260, but maybe maybe I was remembering wrong. The first day was definitely the best day, and that's actually typical with Get Hired. I always have in person. I always have the best attendance on the first day, which is really funny. So that stayed true even in the virtual environment. Thanks, Florence. So again, just quickly, in respect for wrapping up at 1 o'clock, when you have clear learning goals and scaffolded goals so that they make sense to your learners from beginning to end, I found it actually reduced the number of decisions we had to make about content. So that's actually been true for Get Hired in person, and that's actually been true for moving Get Hired online. It made the number of decisions we had to make easier, particularly with moving it online. It helped us reduce desire for bells and whistles. You know, like, do we really need that fancy thing? No, we can make this activity work so that it still aligns with the learning goal for this presentation, for this activity, and we don't need that fancy thing, which is usually a whole lot more work for your tech person to figure out anyway how to make it work. And sometimes those fancy things actually increase the chances of a Zoom bombing. So that certainly made our lives a little bit easier. And a word that Adrian used that I really enjoyed was redundancy, and that was in regard to people power. When you have redundancy, you have the capacity to handle a surprise or an emergency, like one of our speakers losing the power in his house halfway through his presentation. It really didn't interrupt the flow of activities in a super significant way. I was able to carry forward. Adrian and Florence in the background were able to communicate with the guests what happened, and that was really effective. The Backchannel was really helpful for keeping everybody on board, and making sure that everybody had some knowledge, some comfort with the tool was really helpful as well. And I mean, certainly running this conference with people I know, whose expertise I trust, people I can laugh with, you know, when something didn't go well in the practice run, it's like, oh, okay, let's not do that on the day of. That certainly made it a lot easier as well. So trust and clear roles made a lot of difference, I think, for us as well. You can read this on your own. This was just some additional thoughts that we had. The number one that I will highlight was attendance. And so when attendance hit something like 400 and we realized, okay, Zoom meetings is probably not the platform we're going to be able to use, we sort of had to assume that most people were going to show up. Now, the Get Hired conference usually has about a 1/3 no-show rate. It was higher last year, even though it was still in person. I'm not sure why. Just so you know, the attendance rate was about 56% each day on average. So that's something to keep in mind, that you can push your actual registration well up over the expected. And actually, I can tell from the number of people who were logged in today, we still had a show up rate of about 60%. So I think a lot of people are looking forward to the recording. So when you're doing things online, certainly you can definitely overbook, would be one of the biggest lessons that we learned. So thank you so much for the Q&As. At this point, I am going to, because it's 1 o'clock, I'm going to thank Adrian and Florence. We are going to be hanging around for what's called the CMPN, the Career Minded Professionals Network. That's a group of University of Toronto folks. I will ask folks who are not from U of T if you would kindly say farewell. It was lovely to see you. We'll send the recording as soon as we can. Give us a couple of business days. And CMPN folks, if you could hang around, I will shortly pass the torch over to Marg.